help me welcome Dr. Linda. So I'm going to get your title right. Dr. Macri is the Director of Academic and Professional Development for the Graduate School. He is also the Director of the Graduate School's Center for Writing and Oral Communications. And she knows her stuff. And she has resources and information to share with all of you. So I'm really glad you're here. Linda, take it away.
Good introduction. So I'm going to talk citations, plagiarism, and generative AI. In an hour, that's a lot. But I'm also going to go through my slides. Feel free to ask questions at any point, but I'll also try to leave plenty of time at the end for more specific questions too. So as Debbie said, I'm the Director of the Center for Writing and Oral Communications. I've got some of these in the back, but we just next one. Our stickers just have our name, but if you have the name, then you can look it up. So if you've never been to the Writing and Oral Communication Center before, our name pretty much describes what we do. We're here to support graduate students in whatever writing or speaking you need to do, from brainstorming papers to polishing them, from getting your presentation for a class or a conference ready, or practicing it, etc. Like Graduate Legal Aid, most of our services are available via Zoom these days, although we do have a physical location in McAllen. And I do a lot of workshops like these, like this one rather. So there's the, I'm gonna, there we go. Oh, shoot. Somehow my slides didn't go. I have a QR code for the slides at the end, and I know Debbie's gonna email them. I can tell you, I don't know why it fell off, but it should be go.umd.edu/ethical AI, all lowercase, if you want to look at them now, or you can scan the code at the end and find the slides. But these are all hot. There's plenty of hot links on here for more information. All right, so let me get started. We're going to talk about why and a little bit about how we cite. We're going to talk about what academic integrity is and what plagiarism is, more about how to cite effectively, and then talk about how to use generative AI ethically when you write. So I'm not here to talk about how you use it for research or anything else, but there's a lot of questions about how to use it ethically when you write. And so I'll talk some about that, and then hopefully you'll have lots of questions. So let's just dive in. Why and how do we cite things when we write? I could ask, but I won't make you work just yet. So why do we cite things? Why do you think we do it? I would say that the most important thing is that we do it to communicate that we were having a conversation with a source. And that's probably not what any of you were thinking of, right? You were trying to stay out of trouble, to prove where we got ideas, etc. But from at this point in graduate school, all your work is built on the work of others, right? Your job in graduate school is to further research that others have done. Your research is gonna build on what others have done. So the idea that you are communicating and you've been in conversation, that may feel like very, very nice when what you were doing was reading that article and trying to figure out what in God's name it was actually talking about, right? Conversation may seem like a nice idea, but with the source, right? So wherever your ideas were coming from, your work is in conversation, building on it, asking questions, responding to it, and that's what you're communicating. So that's really what I want you to think about when we think about why we're citing things. Because if you remember this, that what we're doing in graduate school is building on the work of others, your research adding to a bigger conversation about a field, then citation practice is less about, oh, did I get this wrong? Am I going to get caught? And more about, have I faithfully explained to my readers where are my ideas? So your readers expect, when they read your work, they expect to hear what you have to say. And that's true when you publish a paper. That's true when a professor asks you to fulfill an assignment, right? Your professors don't want to know what other sources say. They want to know your understanding of what those sources say, right? So your reader expects to hear what you have to say in a paper, in an article, etc. Your reader recognizes that you're joining an academic conversation, but they've come to your paper to read your stuff, right? To read your perspective. So you need to provide that, and you need to make it clear, right? You need to provide your perspective, not just a list of references, like here's everybody else's ideas. Even if what you're being asked for is an annotated bibliography, almost as close as you can get to everybody else's ideas, the annotations are still what I think about it, right? Where you think, your understanding, right? So your professors don't need you to tell them again what an article said, right? They probably know those articles. But what they need is you to reference the work, not just reference the work of others, but offer analysis, synthesis, you're commenting, you're discussing, versing those. I'll build on this a little because I know it's a kind of different way of looking at it, maybe. So when your reader sees a citation, and they should see lots of them in your papers, that's an indication that your idea has a source, right? I got this idea from somewhere. I'm building on an idea that I got from somewhere. But there's still an expectation that the words are yours, right? That the words are your expression of that idea and not just the direct words from the source. If it's the direct words from the source, it needs quotation marks along with a citation, right? So if I don't see quotation marks in a paper, I think, but I see a citation, I think, okay, well, these ideas came from the source, but it's your articulation of that. Right? So what should you be doing? One thing is you should be concise with those other sources, right? Because again, I've come to your paper to read your ideas. So yeah, sure, tell me what they were about, what they were based on, but do that as concisely as possible. Concisely, honestly, right? An honest paraphrase and a clear indication of what was yours and what's the sources, right? So that includes a citation. That includes if you use your direct quotation, I need to know that. But otherwise, as concisely as possible, you want to talk about that. All right. And then don't expect those sources to do the work for you. Again, the point of you doing work is for you to explain what you understood about the source, why you're using it, why it's important, why it shapes your thinking, why it's a text that others should care about. So don't make them do the work for you. Don't just kind of drop them in and expect that your readers understand, right? Be sure that whenever you include a source, it's clear to whoever's reading your paper how the source adds to your ideas, right? Why. Hopefully this is on the. Okay, so then when do we cite things, right? So basically the answer is every time you refer to the ideas of someone, right? Every time. That includes when you're using a direct quotation, and I'll point out also that in some of your fields, you will never see a direct, or almost never see a direct quotation, right? If you're in engineering, you'll almost never use a direct quotation. The only time I've ever seen a direct quotation is in an engineering paper is when they're quoting from other fields, right? It's like looking at someone's, one of the faculty in engineering, and they were using a concept from economics, and there was a direct quotation, right? Because that's unfamiliar even to them. So direct quotation, but in some fields you're never using. That's really unusual to be using a direct quotation. And it's not because you can just put the words in there and that's okay. It's that you really should always be putting it in your own words, right? We'll talk a little bit more about direct. So you need a citation when you use a direct quotation, when you use any kind of data, figures, data, statistics, whatever, from your source. And anytime that you've used an idea, a theory, a methodology, whatever, from another source. So again, anytime you're referencing someone else's ideas, you need a citation. There we go. And that citation needs to be both in the text, so in the paper that I'm reading, and at your reference list at the end, whether that's a reference list, a bibliography, whatever it's being called, right? And then two things to remember: if you have it in your text, if you have a reference in your text, make sure it's at the end on your bibliography. And for the most part, if you have a citation on the reference list at the end, make sure that it's clearly in your paper somewhere. It used to be this thing back in the dark ages. In my field anyway, in English, we used to talk about bibliographies. Sometimes I would cite things that had informed my thinking broadly, but didn't make it up, didn't ever make it clearly to my text. But that's not the case for the most part anymore. Your works cited references only when you actually. Alright, so then a little bit about how do we cite. I'm just gonna give you an explanation, a couple of examples. I'm gonna use two, one from APA, which is most of what you're using in the social sciences, and use APA. Okay, and then one from IEEE, which is what you're largely using in engineering. And then lots of STEM fields use some weird version that's not quite IEEE, but it's pretty similar. So we use an APA example first. So here is the text as you would read it, right? You just read this chunk of information. Multiple mothering ideologies have been identified in the literature, including intensive mothering, AIDS 1996, competitive mothering, Toronto 2001, combative mothering, Warren Evans 2016, and integrated motherhood, Dow 2016. So now you're all wondering what kind of mother you have. It's fine. So that's what it would look like in the text. I'm specifically going to use this. Simply to use this, and Dow, Professor Dow is a professor in sociology. So that's what it would look like in the text, and then in your reference list at the end, you would include the article, right? And this is the APA style, the name, the year, the title, the journal, and all the journal information, right? So in the in-text citation, what APA cares about is just the author's name generally and the year, and then all that information has to show up at the reference list. That's how we see that. So that's in text and a reference list, and all citation styles have something in text and something on a reference list. IEEE is completely, well, not completely, but IEEE is different. Here's an article. This is actually a preprint, which I thought was a good example. Lots of you are probably using preprints. Chen is also a professor here. Right, so here's what it looks like in the body of the text. Right from the body of the text. Code large language models such as GitHub, Copilot, and Amazon Code Whisperer have been used in by millions of developers. See these numbers? 2, 3, that's not a list of LLMs, right? 4, 5, 6, those are in fact the citations, right? These are in-text citations in IEEE style, right? And they correspond to sources at the end. IEEE is different, right? They don't even care that much about, whereas APA cared about who said this and when was it. IEEE wants as little information, as little interruption as possible. If you care, go. Of course, these are hot links. And you click on them. And so that's what it looks like in text, and then this is what it looks like on the reference, right? 1 was this, 2 was this, 3 was this, etc. So the same, basically, it works the same, but just the order, the style is a little bit different. But everything uses both an in-text citation and a reference. Is that any good? Right, let's go to the next question then. What is academic integrity and plagiarism? So what are these big questions? So academic integrity, right? All universities have a code of academic integrity, academic honesty, etc. Here's Maryland's. I know you can't see it over here. It's from the president's page. If you clicked on this, which you would if I'd given you the right link before. This is from the office of the president. And here's what it says. Here's the introduction. And hopefully this sounds a little bit like the ideas that I was giving you about the cite, right? That idea of a conversation in a community, right? University of Maryland College Park is an academic community. Its fundamental purpose is the pursuit of knowledge. The university functions properly in fulfilling this mission when its community members adhere to clearly established goals and values. Essential to the fundamental purpose of the university is the commitment to the principles of truth and academic honesty. So that's the underlying value system around academic honesty, and plagiarism is a subset of that. So if you looked at this page, if you looked at this page, you'd find this, but you'd also eventually find a link to this page, the Office of Student Conduct. Right, this reviews looked at it, right? Code of academic integrity. What did it kind of look like in act? The previous page was on the president's website. Here's the legalistic part. What is it actually? Code of academic integrity lists the expectations of you as a student and your academic work by underlying the 5 academic integrity violations, sanctions, and incidents. What is academic misconduct? So academic misconduct, so academic misconduct, first of all, is obviously failing to have academic integrity, right? So misconduct is the flip side. And at Maryland, we think of it in 5 categories: cheating, fabrication, facilitation, plagiarism, and self-plagiarism. I'm largely going to talk about plagiarism, but if you have questions about the others, I can answer those. So here's plagiarism. If we clicked on this page, this is what it said. This is what plagiarism is. It's representing the words or ideas of another. And another is typical, we're talking about here, as one's own in any academic course, exercise, research, not including but not limited to articles, proposals, dissertations, and theses. So when you're writing any of these, if you represent that the words you have put down on the page are yours when they're not, then that's plagiarism, right? And so that includes things like failing to cite. It includes things like using something that you generated in term AI and not acknowledging that you generated it in term AI, right? So representing that they came from the words came from somewhere else, but you haven't made that clear. So that includes things like not citing material or doing so incorrectly. Means paraphrasing without citation. So you could have done an amazing paraphrase, but if you didn't cite things, it's still plagiarism. And then not properly attributing ChatGPT when ChatGPT is expressly permitted by instructors. And I had a little asterisk there because for whatever reason, student conduct page uses ChatGPT as a synonym for generative AI, right? So it doesn't mean, so this does not mean, well, it's okay if you use Copilot, right? Oh, well, they came from Turb AI, you don't have, they should change this from ChatGPT generative AI, but they haven't, so I want to represent it honestly because we're talking about integrity. So, all right, that's plagiarism. So let's dig down into that a little bit. Or to the actual stuff. So they say paraphrasing without citation, right? Not citing material or doing so incorrectly, paraphrasing without citations. So before we talk about anything about generative AI, let's just make sure we're right about plagiarism. So plagiarism is more than just paraphrasing, right? You could maybe put it in a few categories that are useful. Sometimes when you're referencing a source, you're just mentioning them or just citing them, right? And I have examples on the next slides, right? Sometimes you're mentioning, right? You're maybe naming the author and talking about their ideas really, really broadly, right? Not even really a paraphrase, just a really broad, like they wrote a book about mothering, right? That's very general. It's not even. Sometimes you're even just citing sources. We'd often say that what we saw in IEEE is largely citation. So you're just kind of saying, here's where big ideas. Sometimes you are paraphrasing, putting things in your own words, and then obviously you are doing direct quotation, but again, that's really discipline specific. We're going to look at cases in each of these just so that. And here's the question again. Right? These are mentions, right? This Stone here and Williams 2000 each provided a nuanced analysis of how dominant cultural and structural forces in the workplace are in tension with those of the family, often favoring male workers and constraining women's choices. Blair, Lloyd, Gerson, Stone, Lee. There's 2 things happening in this paragraph, actually. I would say these first 2 references to Stone and Williams are just a mention. We're just mentioning big ideas. Here's their names. Here's when they published, and if we right, their work broadly provided nuanced analysis of how dominant culture and instructional work. By contrast, these at the end we would say are citation only, right? Oops, sorry. Right, these are just citations, and why are we doing that? Why are we doing that? Right, so here's like intention with those in the family, often favoring male workers and constraining women's choices. So this is one sentence, and it has 1, 2, 3, 4 citations, right? So those last 2 are okay. Why so many citations for one sentence? And why are we? What are these that we're clearly being told what Stone and Williams have to do with it? But what about Blair and Lloyd? Why are they being cited? Yeah, I don't think it quite raises to the level of paraphrase, right? Because it's so general, right? It's just kind of saying these guys too, right? But that's
So when I cited like that, is because I got whatever I got from one article, and then in that article, there was another reference to that idea. That's how I do it.
Okay, it could be that, right? It's kind of like, these are the more specific ideas, but they're represented more broadly in like issues of those articles, yeah. So I would say, right, it's the, yeah, right, Stone and Williams each provided a nuanced analysis of how dominant cultural and structural forces in the workplace are in tension with those in the family, right? Right, that's, we can clearly know if I look at Stone or Williams, I'm gonna see in each of them a nuanced analysis, et cetera, often favoring male workers and constraining women's. And I'm gonna assume, without, I read all this, right, that these other sources, Blair, Roy, and Gerson, are also talking more broadly. That's why less specific than a paraphrase, right? Even more broadly, they're talking about the ways that dominant cultural things in the workplace, family, constraints in women's choices, that these sources are also talking about this same subject. And part of the reason that you bother including them is, again, to say, here's who I'm in conversation with. It's not just Stone and Williams who have offered a nuanced analysis, but it's these other guys, these other authors, right? Blair, Loy, and Gerson have also informed my perspective. I'm not being really specific about them, but they are in that as well.
Just curious about the order of what the authors mentioned. So, or Stone and Williams in this case, I've mentioned like at the louder side,
Yeah.
because they were mentioned earlier, and then the Roy and Gerson's, I guess, or citation is more relevant to.
Yep, that's a great question, right? So they're mentioned here because we are saying very specifically, they do this, right? And then I think the Stone and Williams are mentioned again because they're also like more broadly talking about these issues. And then the order here is straight up alphabetical, right? Right, Blair, Gerson, Stone, Williams. That's typical, but not always the case, right? You could also, you might also organize them by date, right? 1985, 2000, but that word, I got that, 1985, 2000. But that is the, right here, the really broad ideas I'm organizing by date, but I've pulled out Stone and Williams because I am building a little more. I'm talking more specifically about their nuanced analysis. So mentions and citation. And then here's another example of citation only. Oops, I animate that one. So this is one from Public Health. And again, you don't read it, right? Children are exposed prenatally and in early childhood to multiple environmental stressors that can adversely affect their cognitive abilities, academic performance, and consequent educational trajectories, adult health, wealth, and social status. And then we have two citations there, 1 and 2. And then Project Tender, neurodevelopment, targeting environmental neurodevelopmental risks, a unique collaboration of leading scientists, health professionals, and children's and environmental health advocates points to growing scientific evidence linking exposure to toxic chemicals during early brain development with brain disorders, and calls on individuals, industries, and policymakers to reduce these exposures. 3, right? I'm going to assume, right, 3 is probably clearly talking about Project Tender. Look, you see, oh, I don't know how those are all backwards, but we can see there's all those citations. In this case, this again, this is public health, which is often does this kind of in between thing, not quite APA, not quite IEEE. It's using footnotes, may using Chicago. But again, we pull these up. They're hot links, right? We can see there's 1 and 2 there. Here are these 2 sources, right? This Evans in English, and Landrigan, Roush, and Galvez, right? So that's what those 1 and 2 are, right? We can see those are the citations. So these again are citations only, where we're giving a really broad idea but making sure to cite the information. All right. Paraphrase, on the other hand, right? So a paraphrase is usually representing a specific idea in your own words, right? So a summary, we might even call some of those citations huge summaries, right? They like summarize their work in a few sentences. Paraphrases are more specific up to an idea, a concept, couple of sentences we might think about. So Here's some work by Griffin, she's dean of the graduate school, sorry, she's not dean of graduate school, she's dean of the College of Education. So this is an article by her and Professor Gilbert, and this, the bigger font is something they've written. So Ackerman, DeRamio, and Garza Mitchell, 2009, found that student veterans listed starting college as the most difficult transition out of the military they experienced. Yet, according to Cook and Kim, 2009, only 22% of schools provide veteran-specific transition support. So again, one sentence, two citations, right, to two different articles. And we can see right away, right, we're referencing specific information, right? These people, they found something, they found that student veterans found starting college was a hard transition, and these authors, Cook and Kim, gave us statistics, right? So both of those are paraphrased, and if we found the original source, and boom, we'll look at it. Here's the Ackerman and DeRamio. Here's basically the same, here's the concept, right? Here's where they were paraphrasing from. The focus of our study was the transition that combat veterans make when they become college students. For many with whom we spoke, this, starting college, right, was the most difficult transition. And so we can see how has effectively paraphrased these ideas, right? Found that student veterans, combat veterans, they're students, right? Starting college, right? Became college students, most difficult transition, right? This most difficult transition at all. And so it doesn't mean that they have to change every single word, right? They didn't come up with a new word for veterans. Students who used to be in the military, no, you're allowed to use similar language, right? They were in the military, they started college. So it's less a matter of like, I have to replace every word. And more, we can see that, you know, this is two sentences, they've pressed it into one, given us the basic idea, but not the exact same words, right? They very much put it in their own words and given us a clear citation, right? Introduced it, told us where it came from, 2009. On the other hand, the other part of the sentence, yet, according to Cook and Kim, 2009, only 22% of schools provide veteran-specific transition support. Looked at Cook and Kim, right? This is a little longer, you may see that in the back. Only 22% of institutions with programs and services for military personnel have developed an expedited re-enrollment process to help students restart their academic efforts. Most, 62%, 62% require students who are returning from deployment to complete the standard re-enrollment process, and 60% require students to reapply and be readmitted to enroll. So we can see they're clearly referencing this 22%, right? Only 22% of institutions with programs and services for military personnel have developed an expedited re-enrollment process, right? Only 22% provide veteran-specific transitions. In this, at least in this sentence, they're not interested in the rest of the detail, right? So they don't have to represent all of it. They're calling out what do they care about in their article. They're focused on the schools, 22% of them. Obviously, you can't fudge the number, 22%, 22%, but again, we can see how that paraphrase pulls the ideas here, but, and the factual ideas, right? But puts it in their. Makes sense? I'm sure she's wrong, but she did correctly good paraphrase, but what about me? All right, and then direct quotations. So again, direct quotations are pretty rare. And we'll look at this example really quickly, and then I'll talk a little bit about why you might use them. So this was from American Studies. It's like Forson Williams is what's the chair? Oh, American Studies. Here we can see, if we look, right, you can read the whole thing. We can see a whole quote. As Winston put it, quote, "My mother paid for this place with chicken legs. We first lived in a log cabin, but that burned almost 50 years ago, and we rebuilt further down the road. Another waiter carrier, went on to establish." All right, so that is a direct quotation, quotation marks, and it's clearly representing the source. In this case, somebody she interviewed very precisely, right? I want their exact words. She could have summarized that, right? She could have said, Winston said, for instance, that his mother, that they paid for their log cabin with the cooking work that his mother did. Perfectly good paraphrase. No, she wanted that exact language. for a couple of reasons, right? First of all, humanities often is really based on text. That's the data in the humanities, people's words, lines from Shakespeare, right? Which is different than the data that many of you are using. So humanities tends to use a lot more direct quotations because getting the words right is either needs to be accurate, right? I need to, if I'm talking about the meter in Shakespeare's poetry, I need to give you a clear example of the meter in Shakespeare's poetry. In cases like this, it's because she really wants to honor the voice of the person that she's talking. But in your fields, you may never be needing direct quotations because it's less important to have the specificity of the words and much more important to have the representation of the idea. So very rarely in most fields, unless you're a text-based field where you're analyzing text, you probably aren't using direct quotations. And if you have questions about it. Okay. So how do you avoid plagiarism? This is what you really want to know, right? You avoid it by always referencing your sources with a citation, using a good paraphrase with a citation, and making sure that if you're allowed to use direct quotations, you do so with a citation. So you can see the common denominator in there is, right, in general, so having citations is most of the work, but you also need to be making sure that you've done it correctly, right? That you're referencing things correctly. That's, this is, I think, Debbie has another version of essentially this, which is something, the Writing Center and Graduate Legal Aid put together, a few years ago. That kind of gives a hot take on all of this. There's, again, most of the slides are just find this at on the Writing Center's website. You know, just what's academic integrity, why does this matter, what are we doing very well. All right, so let's get to let's do generative AI. Can you use generative AI ethically when grades? So I'm going to start by asking, and I have no power over any of you. So just be honest. I'm not here to surveil. I have nothing to, no evaluation power over you. Have you used generative AI to write your scholarly work? Okay, so I know at least some of you are lying, right? Because I can prove how many people use it. How many of you have used it for anything you've ever written scholarly? Raise your hands. Okay, great. So yeah. So okay, so that was my next question. How to create outlines for your writing? How do you do that?
So I kind of talk about what I wanted, how I want to come across in the paper, some of the ideas that I want to present. I do a lot of like summarizing. I ask people to summarize what's for me that, that I might, that's really long, and I might time crunch.
Okay, all right. Okay, so you do things like, hey, generative AI, here are the ideas I have, help me put it into it. Okay, or you feed it a paper that you've gotten somewhere that has access.
No,
Oh, no, to write something. How do you get it to write something?
to write, I ask it to write a well, when you talk about, oh, yes,
Yeah,
I'm sorry, yes.
Sorry.
So the readings, yes.
You feed it a
I
reading.
think you're reading and I ask it to help me summarize it.
Hello.
No, I know in writing you post it sometimes so I'm writing this family. I notice if you press the gap button, it changes, it gives you a better way to say it.
Okay, it gives you a suggestion, a stylistic suggestion. So, I'm the wrong person to like tell you all, explain the backgrounds about large language learning models or large language models, sorry, but Grammarly is all generative AI, right? Even not just that, right? It's always been generative AI. Generative is like the large language learning models are a way to feed all that information into something and it predicts based on experience, right? We've seen this in 10,000 pieces, so we're predicting what comes next, right? So that's what's happening. And Grammarly does, but then it does have this like beefed up, we're gonna help you write things. Tell us anything.
I also use it too, because I'm not a native English speaker. I use it to fix my grammar and punctuation sometimes.
Right, lots of people are using it for that, right? Where you're gonna sound like I'm supposed to sound. For coding, okay, which is not exactly the same as using it for scholarly writing. Right, yeah, so so that's, I can't answer those questions about where the ethical line exists for that. People doing it for, I know lots of people use it as a study guide, like here, I didn't come up with this calculation correctly, can you explain to me why? But explicitly for writing, right, having it produce language for you as opposed to other kinds of answers. Other kinds of answers, maybe other kinds of academic honesty violations, but we're gonna talk about it. Alright, so using generative AI has lots of risks and lots of benefits, right? So the risks, hopefully you already know this, right? It first of all can be incredibly biased because it predicts things. It can only give you evidence based on the evidence it has, right? It can only give you a prediction based on what it has, right? So we know that it's incredibly biased, right? Because it tends to have been fed largely things by a certain set of people. And so its output is about those certain set of, right? So it has a lot of bias. It has an error, right? Sometimes it just makes stuff up. It hallucinates sometimes the language being used, right? Which is fun. My wife would say it makes a mistake. There can potentially be privacy violations. So first of all, you should absolutely be aware that anything of whatever you put your words into any kind of large learning model, into any kind of generative AI, you should know what the parameters of privacy are. Be careful about doing things like feeding it your CV, feeding it drafts of your articles. Expressly, you should never, ever put anything into generative AI that you don't have permission to do so with, and that you didn't find on a public site. So that's why I said you put in an article. Sure, you downloaded an article from a site where it's been published, et cetera. There's some concern still about that, but for the most part, that's like, okay, they made it public, so you're not doing anything that the large language model couldn't do on its own. It really flattens tone. That's something to remember, right? It kind of produces something that may not sound like you. For some of you, that may in fact not feel like the risk, that may in fact be the benefit, right? If you're concerned about, I can't write in this way, so I'm fine with its flattened tone, but it does often flatten tone. So everything sounds the same. And then potentially there are ways that you can be using it dishonestly, right? Basically, if you're not checking for these things, you're probably gonna land up having some concerns about dishonesty, right? Flattened tone doesn't make you dishonest, although that is something that sometimes people accuse things of being created with generative AI if it has a certain tone. But obviously it has benefits, it has efficiency. What did you say? I do it because there's just so much to read and I need it to make me summaries, right? And again, it may allow you to accomplish things in your writing that you don't feel you can accomplish, whether that's a certain level of correctness, whether that's whether that's a overlap with efficiency, right? Like yes, I could rephrase this, but it would take me a while. And there are certainly, so I'm a writing teacher, and there's certainly lots of ways that we can think about using generative AI to improve not only the product of a specific use, or not only like a single paper, but also an understanding of writing in general. So here's an example. Like, Grammarly keeps changing my sentences to be this. Why? Like, why is that better? Why is it better? Why do I want that one instead of that? Right? There's potentially learning going on there, right? Potentially a benefit as well. But we're here to talk a little, let's think again about academic integrity, right? So we talked before about plagiarism. Remember this? Oh, whoops, sorry. We talked about plagiarism, but there's all these other things: cheating, fabrication, facilitation, and self-plagiarism. And generative AI can show up as those two, in part because, think about the definition of plagiarism, it's using someone else's words, but that's not the only thing that generative AI does, is give us words, right? It does other things too. So Cheating, this is Maryland's definition of cheating: fraud, deceit, misconduct in any course, exercise, research in an attempt to gain an unfair advantage, using or attempting to use unauthorized material, and that's the hint there. Information or study aids in any academic course, exercise, research, including qualifying and for other graduate student examinations, right? So that might be using answers that have been shared on a Google Doc across people, using, and again, ChatGPT, saying generative AI. Using generative AI when an instructor has expressly forbidden it, right? So if your professor has not said it's okay to use generative AI for this paper, and you use it anyway, even if you acknowledge it, then you are cheating, according to to Maryland's academic state code, right? So, and the onus of responsibility is largely on students for this, right? You need to know if you were allowed to use it or not. Obviously, that means at some point your professors should be telling you should use it or not. But I'll just be honest and say I hear lots of stories from students that there's nothing on the syllabus that says anything. That the professor maybe says somewhere in the middle of the course, you're using Gen AI to do stuff, are you? Don't. Maybe you already have. And so now it's been made explicitly clear that you shouldn't. So it's always your responsibility to know if it's allowed. And then it can also be fabrication, right? Just think about it. What does generative AI do? It creates information. Sometimes it doesn't do it accurately. Right, so falsification, unauthorized falsification or invention of any data, images, information, or citation, and of course, right, so this could be creating a false citation or a bibliography, and generative AI sometimes does that. So if you're using it at all, you absolutely need to double check things, and that takes time, sometimes more time than doing it yourself. Again, generative AI responses aren't authenticated and can be false or made up, right? And also they are. So using generative AI can be plagiarism, but can also be cheating, especially if you're not allowed to be using it, and can be considered fabrication. You just made stuff up and you just used it, and that's it. All right, so is just using it always academic dishonesty? So here again, this is Maryland's honor pledge. This is what you are tacitly, some of your professors may be actively asking you to talk about this. We're gonna sign this, some of them may not, right? I pledge on my honor that I haven't given or received any unauthorized assistance. Right, so that's that. Unauthorized is the pivot point here, right? Instructors should be defining what you should, what you can and can't use for assignments, and then you need to follow that. Then that's how you know if it's authorized or unauthorized. These are hot links that you can go to see that policy. All right, and then there are some other guidelines for the use of generative AI at Maryland. There's tons, many pages on the website about using generative AI. First of all, the university strongly suggests that if you are using it, you use TERP AI, right? Which you have to log in with your Maryland credentials. The benefit of this is that any data that you put in it is not shared, either to, certainly not outside of TERP AI, but it's also not shared with other users, and it's not used to train AI. So it means it doesn't it doesn't become part of the large language model, right? And it can be used to brainstorm, to summarize, to translate things, to edit things, to assist code. So that's the number one. There's my advertisement for TERP AI. There's other things available to you through your Maryland's account, Copilot, and other things as well, but TERP AI does what most of those do. Not all of them, but it does a lot of what you probably do, and it keeps your data safe. So that's what we know. And then you should be citing anytime you're using generative AI. So how do you cite it correctly? Well, the library has a whole page about that. But I'll talk a little bit more about it too, right? So again, we talked about APA style. How do you cite ChatGPT for APA, right? It says I actually need to cite it. If you've used it, again, that should be generative AI, not just ChatGPT. If you've used it, you need to cite it, right? So their example is that you actually say straight up, APA's example is that you say it in your paragraph, right? Right in the prose, right? When prompted with is the left brain or right, is the left brain, right brain divide, real or a metaphor. The ChatGPT generated text indicated this, right? You're quoting it directly and offering the source. This probably feels kind of cumbersome, but that is the expectation that you are quoting it in APA style and both an in-text citation and on the reference, right? But one thing I'll suggest is that kind of worth it? Like, it was feeding that question into generative AI worth it if you then have to go through all of this? Like, you wanted to know the difference between the left brain and the right brain divide. What have you gained really that you couldn't have just gained looking it up on a search engine, quoting directly from a different source that you found search engine? Because again, ChatGPT, you also have to verify that this was right. And you don't know if it's right. How do you verify it? You have to look somewhere else. So it may not be an efficiency to do this. Similarly, MLA, although I doubt many of you are using MLA, also expects a citation, and very similar, right? You cite it whenever you paraphrase, quote, or incorporate it into your work. You acknowledge how you used it, and you take care to vet the secondary sources, right? I take care of it, I make sure it hasn't fabricated. Again, this may not prove to be an efficiency at this point, right? To do those things. And then the other thing to know, you're all graduate students, at some point, many of you will publish things, and journals also have an expectation of citation with generative AI. So here's one from mechanical engineering, reliability engineering. Here's the list of, so this is from this journal. Here's the list from authors of all the kinds of ethics and policies, right? And one of them is you need to declare your use of generative AI in any kind of scientific writing, right? Here's what that means, right? All authors must declare when you've used it. It should only be used in the writing process to improve the readability and language, right? So make my sentences shorter, make sure that this is readable, etc. But that's a fuzzy list, right? I could say, well, gee, you can produce a better sentence than I can. So again, getting iffy there. The technology has to use human oversight, and then you must not list or cite those technologies. So this is interesting. Of course, reliability engineering doesn't use APA or MLA. You have to acknowledge it, but not cite them because they're not human. So you're not citing them. They're not. Right. And then here's the declaration, right? You need to say during the preparation of this work, the authors used whatever you used in order to do whatever you did. After using this, the authors reviewed and edited the content as needed, take full responsibility for the content of the published article. So that's the what journals expect. And then it's important to note, right? They say we never use it in peer review, again, because that would be an unauthorized, right? It would be saying here, this article that hasn't been published yet, I'm just going to feed it to ChatGPT, or I'm just going to feed it to generative AI, which means you've taken away the author's rights to that. These are basically the same. I'm going to speak over those. IEEE then is a little bit different, similar but different than APA and MLA, right? It really says, right? Yes, you may commonly use it for cleaning up your language, editing and grammar. That's outside of this policy, but if you're using it to write things, right, to generate content, then you need to acknowledge that. And that is true for pretty much all journals. Another thing to think about, if you're ever doing any kind of co-authorship, you absolutely want to make sure that whoever you're writing with has agreed to this. So Maryland has a co-authorship agreement in general for graduate students. And you may want to think additionally about a co-author agreement about the use of generative AI. I was at a conference over the weekend. I was talking to a colleague who had written a report, ironically, about generative AI. He'd written it collaboratively with 3 other people. He just at the last end point fed it to ChatGPT to check the grammar. Told his co-authors that he'd done that. They said, I don't want my name on this anymore. I didn't authorize you doing that. I don't want my name on it anymore. Had to go back to who someone had requested this report. They had to go back to the organization that requested it. Took 3 months more for it to get cleared. So have a co-authorship agreement. If you are writing with someone else, make sure you know what they want to do. So I thought it was colleague at Colorado State said, please borrow it as long as we can. And then I'm just gonna leave you with this. This is an article from a scientific journal. You can see which one, right? Article of best practices for using AI when writing scientific manuscripts. It's just a couple of years old, and they came up with a few. Here's their advice, right? Always acknowledge, remind your co-authors, don't use text verbatim from ChatGPT because it can lose things. Any citations need to be verified. It's not an author. It can't be held accountable for anything. And then don't use it to squelch your creativity and deep thinking. And there's good evidence these days that when you're using it, you're not doing the same level of deep thinking. I was reading another article out of MIT where they asked people to write using an LLM, using just a search engine or not using anything at all. And there's clear evidence that brain activity was completely different across those two. In fact, the people who wrote the using an LLM 5 minutes after writing it could not repeat back a sentence of what they heard. So if you are here to learn things, you may want to consider some of these things. And then the big final point of this article, AI language bots are incapable of understanding new information, generating insights for deep analysis, as they are so far, which would limit the discussion with a scientific paper, and ultimately because scientific papers rely on human-generated data and interpretation. Scientific stories require creativity and know-how that will be difficult to replicate using AI-based. My ethical bottom line is if you wouldn't admit it widely, then you shouldn't. Right? If you wouldn't say to whoever asks you, this is how I use generative AI, then you probably are using it. That's a good